How would anarchic courts work? Well, let's say two people have a dispute. They can't resolve it, so they both agree on an arbiter to settle the dispute. The arbiter, who they both agree on, will issue a ruling. Now, there is no force behind the ruling, no guns, and so let's say the court rules against person A. Person A now has two choices: ignore or accept the ruling. Choices have consequences. If he ignores the ruling, then he will pay a price in terms of reputation. A credit report company, or in the absence of a state, a crime report company will lower their rating of this person. Someone who ignores court rulings, we can expect, will have a very low credit or crime rating, as well as a personal reputation, which is true for the current system. O.J. Simpson got off on the court ruling after killing a woman, but he paid the price in his reputation, and looks like he could be going to prison again pretty soon, or already is, or something like that. I don't know. I'm not keeping up. Also, keep in mind that eBay enforces compliance through seller ratings, which is analogous to a credit rating. There's no force behind these seller ratings. It's just people know it's negative enforcement. These kinds of things already exist. These things are already private. Anarchism would only increase the degree. It's nothing new in kind. Nothing new would be created in an anarchic court system, just an expansion of what already is and what already works. If you still think public courts are absolutely necessary, keep in mind that 14% of Americans in the free market disagree. Now, 30% of the U.S. economy is government and 10% of the economy is underground, depending on who you ask. So that means 14% of the free U.S. economy is underground. 14% of the non-government U.S. economy is underground. Now, when you go underground, you have obviously given up access to police protection and the law courts. You have also given up access to private measures of risk assessment, credit ratings, and seller ratings. Why? Because if you started to provide credit reports for underground economic activity, the cops would be all over you instantly. You have also given up access to private courts for the same reasons, and you are also taking a risk of being thrown in jail for your activity. All despite that, 14% of Americans in the free economy choose to go underground than to pay taxes. That is how worthless police protection and the law courts are. A lot of Americans aren't just giving up public protection, but they are taking a risk. And it makes sense, because the court system isn't functional anymore, and you don't even need to flesh out why. I mean, there's plenty of people who can give you line and verse about how crappy our legal system is, but you don't need to flesh out why. The fact that 14% take a risk just to avoid it is all the necessary proof. And on a more fundamental level, if you think about how there are so many people and so few guns. If there are so many people and so few guns, then there's no way that the state can be an effective enforcement of contracts and can be an effective arbiter of problems. So that means that the majority of problems need to be worked out amongst people, because the state just doesn't have enough manpower to deal with all the problems of the world. All right, so just from that alone, we know that the state is not going to be an effective or even particularly important arbiter. And the failure of the public courts has to do with the public courts system being a monopoly, but I hardly think that's necessary. The failure of the public court system is so spectacular that it's common knowledge, and nobody credibly defends the public court system as being efficient anymore. All anyone does today is say that, well, things would be even worse without it. Government is a necessary evil. I'd be very interested to see anyone who claims that private courts either don't exist or are ineffectual. The last line of defense for public courts, and let's be honest, that's what it is, it's a defense. Okay, when people defend public courts, it's not an honest intellectual enterprise, it's a socialized defense. I know this because it's what I was doing. The last line of defense for public courts is the poor. See, in our wonderful system, the poor can't afford to defend themselves from legal predators, so they get help from the public pretenders. In a private system, you could actually have courts that appoint lawyers to both sides, and if you are poor and you get sued, you can insist on a court that does so. Okay, now let's say a rich man sues a poor man, and the poor man refuses the trial because he can't afford representation. The poor man can then insist on a parity court, we'll call it. The court that the rich man chose can then review the financial situation of the poor man, and in all likelihood agree that the case should be settled in a parity court. And if the court itself gets bribed, and if the rich man's courts itself gets bribed into ruling in favor of the rich man by default that the poor man didn't show up, then that court is going to lose credibility, and the credit report companies will no longer accept rulings from that rich man from the rich man court which got bribed. Okay, that's just one way integrity could be maintained. And you know what? It's something I just made up on the fly. Okay, imagine what someone who really thought this through could come up with. Okay. But it all comes down to the fact that people solve problems all the time, and a state is here's the big thing that all anarchists that is the fundamental thing that anarchists that made me an anarchist. A state is just people. What's more is that the people in the state are not incentivized to solve problems. They are incentivized to grow their departments. And whether they actually solve problems is immaterial. It's immaterial. Why? Because there's no competition. If a court issues a shit ruling, there's no legal recourse anyone can take except other public courts. So think about it. So here's how sick this is. If a lower court issues a shit ruling, or has a reputation of issuing shit rulings, what are people going to do? They're going to appeal a lot. They're going to create more jobs for the courts. They're going to create more business for the public courts. Okay, that's how shitty the public court system. That's what happens when you have a monopoly on the court system. I don't know how many laws there are, but there are so many laws on the books that if someone wants you, they can sue you. Okay. Anyone who hates you enough can just inspect and inspect and inspect until they find some arcane law that you broke. But of course, ignorance of the law is no excuse. When you have so many laws on the books that are structured in a way that you can basically be sued on a whim, that is operationally no different from there being no law. But it's worse than that because the state has a monopoly on the courts. They can issue shit rulings and are accountable to no one. And in that sense, the current situation is worse than anarchy. Much worse. In fact, anarchy is pretty good.